Here's Mae.
Good evening. This is Mae Brussell in Carmel, California. It's broadcast number 501, the beginning of, I've completed 10 years on the air, starting another series. The way the news breaks every day, there are one or two articles that pertain to past subjects that I've brought up on the air in the past 10 years and the articles I've written. And it's quite nice to see some of these exposés being revealed even at a very late date that confirms some of the outrageous allegations that I've made or that my coworkers have made and other researchers and authors around the country. There's an article in the paper this week, Associated Press story you might have seen. Scientists doubt body that was that of Eva Braun. I've done many broadcasts on Adolf Hitler and Eva Braun, his mistress, who he allegedly married just at the time they were supposed to have died. In 1978, May of 78, on KLRB, I did a broadcast mentioning that August Wilhelm Bartholdy, a cook that was in the kitchen, double of Adolf Hitler's, that allegedly took the place of the Fuhrer. This article is by Professor Ryder Sognes, S-O-G-N-N-E-S, from Norway. He's been at UCLA as a dean there for a guest in the School of Dentistry. He said he helped identify the remains of the Nazi dictator Adolf Hitler and that he had doubts about the identity of the woman found near the Berlin bunker where Hitler and Braun reportedly had killed themselves April 30th, 1945. The Nazi officials allegedly had taken their bodies out and doused them with gasoline and set them on fire. He said that the identification of Eva Braun was based on a dental bridge made for her, which the Soviets said they recovered intact from the body, and when the fire burned, the woman's face was burned beyond recognition, and the white plastic teeth were allegedly intact. And this particular dentist had taken the bridge that wasn't found with the body, and he tried to identify it and found out that the very dental technician who made the false teeth told him later, just recently, that they were still in the workshop when Berlin fell and they never fitted in Eva Braun's mouth, that whatever was found there on the ground wasn't hers, and that Russians then said what they found had later been destroyed. As I say, I've done many broadcasts on whether or not Hitler and Eva Braun did escape and did in fact go down to Argentina and Antarctica. I got out several books on the death of Adolf Hitler, and I'm not going to do too much on that tonight. I just wanted to mention that it was in the news again. There's one book called The Death of Adolf Hitler by Lev Bazamensky, and he refers to the William Shirer account in The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich, that their bones were never found, and it gave rise to rumors that Hitler had survived. All traces were wiped out. There's another book by Alan Bullock on Adolf Hitler, that what happened to the ashes of the two bodies has never been found, that they allegedly were disposed of, thrown to the wind, but that open fire will not destroy the human body so completely as to leave no traces and nothing found in the garden. The circumstance of in this book he describes of Hitler and Goebbels and their last days together leaves a lot to be questioned about the ashes and Adolf Hitler. He refers to the examination that this author went in Germany after the war to ask about the teeth, in particular anatomical parts of the woman that was supposed to be Eva Braun, the anatomical characteristics of the body. He goes into the age of the woman and the surface of the teeth, and the most important anatomical finding for identification of the person was the gold bridge of the lower jaw and the lower front teeth. There was extensively charred corpse that was found, and there was splinter injuries to the throat and injuries on the lung and to the body. They didn't account for how that happened and passed that off, that maybe in moving the bodies that these injuries came. But it could have been a double who was also injured when they took her and poisoned her and cremated whoever was there. Although, as I say, the cremation, the ashes were never seen and the bodies were never seen. The conclusion of this book, this one book, says that the injuries of Eva Braun weren't inconsistent with what happened in the bunker, but he goes at great length about the identification of the teeth, and now it turns out years later that this, in fact, is not the truth. This investigator went to the person who made the teeth for Eva Braun and got an explanation about the teeth, and now it seems that the particular bridge work they're talking about was not in that bunker. The same week that this story broke, July the 11th, this week, Dr. Walter Langer passed away. Now, he's another author who wrote The Mind of Adolf Hitler, and interestingly enough, in 1943, he wrote for the OSS. He worked for the OSS, which became the CIA, that Hitler would commit suicide. And this reminds me of the book The Black Abductor, the story of Patty Hearst that was written several years before she was abducted, and many other books written by the OSS and then later the CIA of detailed events before they take place. And it's interesting that a man who worked with the OSS, Dr. Walter Langer, becomes the expert on the suicide of Adolf Hitler and wrote it 2 years before it happened. And he wrote it in 1943, the time that the Nazis were going underground and realized they couldn't win the war and would make plans for later. So part of the plans might have included the suicide because the OSS was working with Hitler's SS, the stormtroopers, for moving them out of Germany and out of the country to South America for protection and for usefulness against a Third World War against the Soviet Union later on. I'm not going to do much this evening, as I say, on the death of Hitler or Eva Braun or whether they're alive or not. I did pull out some notes from another book written, it's called Who Killed Hitler, that I've done broadcasts on, edited by Herbert Moore and James Barrett. And the foreword is written by the former chief of intelligence officer of the U.S. Army in Berlin. He said, I was assigned to find Adolf Hitler and the body immediately upon the entry of American troops in Berlin, and I can state positively I did not find Hitler, nor did I find his physical remains. I have not been able to find any evidence that the body was burned, and I've been unable to locate any persons who witnessed Hitler's last days in the Reich Chancellery. During my stay in Berlin, I lived with the chief of British intelligence. I shared his knowledge of all known reports regarding Hitler's probable fate, and this would include Eva Braun, who was with him. For this reason, I cannot overstress the fact that I have never been able to find any reliable witness of Hitler's activities after April 22nd. 9 days before the date of the supposed suicide. Under those circumstances, I never stood on what substance Hugh Trevor Roper based the official British intelligence report that came out November the 1st, 1945, and furthermore, he wrote it when the Chancellery had not been investigated or opened until December the 12th, 1945, and he describes Hitler's double, who was 54, an individual in physical specifications of the Fuhrer, who occasionally was used for non-speaking public occasions, who was assigned to the Fuhrer's household staff as assistant cook, and never was permitted to show himself outside of the underground kitchen those last days from April, the end of April, until May the 1st, and was never seen again afterwards. So I have many books on the death of Hitler, but I've mentioned them on broadcast before, and I think it's interesting that one of the men who wrote The Mind of Hitler, who wrote about his suicide, worked for the OSS, and the story of Eva Braun's dentures was completely fabricated. The stories about Hitler are important because it is my belief, based upon several hundreds of books, maybe 200 or 300 books I have, that the era never ended, and it is leading us up to what Hitler wanted, which was specifically World War III, to weaken the United States and Great Britain and keep the Germans in South America, Africa, Middle East strong while we fight each other out. Apropos of that, a few news stories you might have seen this week that go along those lines that I watch every day and get a little bit nauseated as I think of the entrenchment of the Nazis, not the neo-Nazis, but the Nazis with OSS and Allen Dulles from 1943 on up to the present time. The Washington Post had an article Monday, July 6th, George Ball, that old Cold War obsession. And this is what he says. I'll just do a few sentences. John Foster Dulles, he was Secretary of State through the entire Cold War, and Allen Dulles, his brother, was head of the OSS, working with Himmler and the Nazis and planning underground to work with the British against the Soviet Union later on. John Foster Dulles is alive and well and living in the White House, Once again, we hear his passionate charge that the Soviet Union is the Antichrist, threatening civilization with a pernicious document. The Soviets, we are told by President Reagan and Secretary Hague, are responsible for our international troubles, for our political turmoil, for every small Latin American country, for turbulence in the Middle East, for tribal wars in Africa, for terrorism all over the world. Now once more we shiver at the idea of Cold War. Diplomacy is for sissies. A resolute America must build bigger and stronger weapons. We must arm any regime, no matter how corrupt or repressive, that shouts anti-communist slogans. I strongly suspect there is a White House directive requiring every administration speech to include a denunciation of evil Soviet communists. Such an attitude is not a policy but an obsession, grotesquely oversimplified. It is outdated. Whatever the situation 40 years ago, it no longer exists. And it goes on to denounce Hague and Reagan for throwing the Allen Dulles speeches out every time they open their mouths, and everyone in the State Department. The headlines this week, these are just in the past week. One Associated Press story, White House policy on human rights is scrapped as the key to arms sales, and it's about dumping any idea of human rights and arming every dictator who wants weapons. LA Times, July the 7th, one-way street to South America. Reagan overtures to the rightist regimes and brings nothing back, no return yet. San Francisco Examiner, Latin American advisors emphasize the military, and it goes into the team in Latin and Central America that were active in Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, destabilized and killed Allende in Chile, and it mentions Vernon Walter, who I mentioned on the program last week. Associated Press, July the 11th, lawyer reports torture of Chilean prisoners. They're using electroshock, beatings, forcing people to listen while their wives and children are tortured in adjoining rooms. It's going on presently. July the 7th, 28 massacred in El Salvador. They shrug it off. Peasants are slaughtered. There is common talk of dumping them, and there's no attempt to identify them. They're put in common graves. July the 2nd, rights group says Salvadorians are abusing, and they continue to abuse. They're melting faces off with acid, they're beheading people, they're mutilating their bodies, and they're torturing their victims. July the 4th, Marcos named premier, and the opposition labels the praise by Vice President Bush as ignorant. The opponents to Marcos are locked up. This is the Washington Post. Hundreds of political prisoners in jail. Bush assumes we had a real election. It was false. The election is a farce. Marcos is a dictatorship. July the 4th, Washington Post. West Germans see indication of growing anti-Americanism. They're upset by America. They're even throwing rocks at the great giant arches of the McDonald's hamburgers over there. John J. McCloy, former Allied High Commissioner in post-war Germany, said, I've never been as concerned as I am now about our alliance with Germany. And it goes on to say Germany wants to stay out of the United States-Russia conflict. John J. McCloy was chairman of the Chase Manhattan Bank. He was on the Warren Commission. He protected Nazis like George de Mohrenschildt and about 20 other Nazis that worked with Lee Harvey Oswald in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. Washington Post, July 2nd, United States foreign policy worries Mitterrand. The United States and Central American policy, he says people are crying for help, and the only one that goes to them is Fidel Castro. His answer to that was to appoint Regis Debray, the former Bolivian assistant to Che Guevara, to help Mitterrand with the Third World. July the 5th, Los Angeles Times, Argentina gripped by severe social problems. The economy has high inflation, joblessness. The junta keeps a strong control. July the 3rd, New York Times, Argentina is putting pressure on the press. The only free press in the newspaper, the only publisher, Manfred Schoenfeld, got out of his car last week and had 5 teeth knocked out by brass knuckles. New York Times, this last week, Moscow calls the U.S. decision to sell arms to China highly dangerous. So the policy we've used since World War II isn't working in any country. This is just a rundown of a few articles. This isn't a broadcast on world events, just a few. And then our ally this last week, South Korea, says it can leave the North Korea in ashes, and hence it will have a nuclear attack over there. We give them the nuclear bombs. We praise the president of South Korea, who sat at a dinner table and murdered his own appointment. His own president over there was right there doing the murdering. He's entertained in the White House, and we'll get the fallout of his atomic bombs making North Korea ashes. We give them the weapons, we give them the power, we give them the prestige like Marcos. Then we're going to sit back and watch all of this come down. Meanwhile, that crazy administration in Washington, an article, "The Panel to Study the U.S. Manpower Needs for a Global War." They're serious, and you better watch it. Another New York Times article this last week, Weinberger, Secretary of the Defense, urging retaliatory ability. He wants a capacity for a conventional strike of the Soviet Union at any place of their choice. Wherever it would give us the pleasure to attack, we should have expansionism. He wants to increase military aid in Egypt, in Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and other nations. We should send them weapons and money for military aid and prepare to fight this kind of a war. And it goes on and on. Before we get into other subjects, in that book on the death of Adolf Hitler that I was quoting before, there's a section about Adolf Hitler in the bunker at the very end of the war in 1945 in the spring. And remember, he was supposed to have died in May the 1st in 1945, the end of April. I do not make the claim, this author says, that I can present my readers with every last detail of how intensively and by what channels of an understanding Hitler had with the Anglo-Saxon Western powers. In the memoirs of Himmler, the chief of intelligence for Adolf Hitler, and of his personal physician, there's ample and varied material, factual and analytical, in their works to give the obvious conclusion that the idea of an anti-Soviet plot matured in widely different circles, and they had direct contact, the Nazis, Himmler, and the German Nazis, with American and English personalities. The idea of the plot was strongly worked out with Himmler's SS leaders and with the United States and British officials. British Foreign Secretary Halifax had a conversation with Hitler in 1937, and later Hitler said he would be delighted with a meeting with Halifax, and he said, "I've always said the English will get under the same eider down with me. In their politics, they will follow the same guidelines I do to annihilate Bolshevism." Hitler talked about tensions between the Western powers. He thought Western powers and Soviet Union would meet head-on, and he would play for time. And in 1944, Hitler was convinced that England and America would be willing to make a separate peace with Germany. And Hitler's idea was to have a collision between the Western powers and the Soviet Union. And after his conferences with his high officials, he said, "Gentlemen, you will see that I am proved right." They were making arrangements for this as early as 1943, so that's why I'm very suspicious that with Martin Bormann and Himmler and the top officials at Hitler's bunker, and with a cook and double there and no visible proof that this man was dead, there'd be no reason why he wouldn't continue on where he allegedly has gone, according to a lot of good sources, to watch this come down. Hitler planned, this book says, the Battle of the Bulge at the end of 1944 to maneuver the Western powers into a separate peace with him. And Himmler was allegedly offered Eisenhower, the SS, Hitler's SS, and his armed forces if they would continue the war against Russia. And the Anglo-Americans would enter into an armistice, and they would leave their weapons, and they would do this. And Himmler and his top officials and personnel staff established at the end of the war with Allen Dulles, he was the head of the OSS, and with that great writer who passed away this week, who in 43 was saying Hitler would be committing suicide for the OSS, met with Allen Dulles in Italy and planned with Hitler's approval, and it was written up in Martin Bormann's diary that they would meet, and on February the 6th, 1945, Hitler's agents were meeting with the British and the Americans and Allen Dulles and making arrangements for the war against the Soviet Union. Hitler felt that we would fall into this pattern and beat ourselves up, the Americans and the British, and use the German industrialists, and that's what seems to be happening. Certain people may consider the attempts of the leadership of the Third Reich to establish a political and military alliance with the United States and England as remarkably political farsight on the part of Hitler, Himmler, and Ribbentrop. And this book goes on to the fact that they would do it under an organization of the men such as Adenauer and Allen Dulles, who later created NATO. That's what Alexander Hague was the head of, NATO, NATO, the organization of the North Atlantic Pact of agents that would arm against with Adolf Hitler's men for the war against Russia. They would fight communism in the post-war years, and the Minister of Propaganda would help them. In this one book on Adolf Hitler said they are speaking of a Third World War. The concept of a Third World War is an established term in the Anglo-American press. And when I went back and began to collect books of the period of 1945, 1946, it was indeed an accepted fait accompli that what we're reading about in the papers these days about a possible Third World War was written up very much, and there were many, many articles about the possibility or the probability that Hitler and Eva Braun escaped. Another article in the paper this week of interest, the Pope picks a panel to aid in funds crisis. Now, this article describes a financial crisis that the Vatican is bankrupt. The Pope is having a meeting. In November of 1971, he called a meeting of 130 cardinals. They had a deficit of $20 million in 1979, $28 million later, and another $30 million. The Vatican has neither confirmed nor denied how much money. The shaky funds of the Vatican are linked to Michael Sindona, who combined money of the Vatican and the Franklin National Bank in New York, among other things, great holdings of the Vatican that were lost. Sindona is now imprisoned in the United States. This is a United Press article this week, July the 7th. He's imprisoned in the United States because of the failure of the National Bank crisis. He was a financial consultant to the Vatican, 1969 to 1970, and the Franklin National Bank and the Vatican lost their money when the bank collapsed. This is July 1981 that this admission is coming out, and I referred to broadcast November the 9th, 1979. That was broadcast number 414, where I talked about the links of the finances of the Vatican going broke. There was an article of the deficit of the Los Angeles Times in 1979. The New York Times had another article, but interestingly enough, the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times articles, and New York Post refer to the links of Michael Sindona to organized crime to the Gambino family and linking the Vatican money, which is the scandal, to various members of the Carlo Gambino family and the New York crime connections related to Italy. So now, in July 81, they're talking about the Vatican going broke. But earlier, one of the causes was not only the Franklin National Bank going, but Sindona's tying up this money with organized crime in the Gambino family. There's an article in the paper this last week. Gambino family is the biggest crime family in the world. It seems to have taken over now as the largest family. Well, no wonder if you tie in the Republican Party and some of the Democrats and the Vatican money and these bank failures that are siphoning money in and out of narcotics combines. Gambino family is A1, and that's the one that Sindona worked with, and Licio Gelli, who's fled Italy, and the entire crime syndicate, Vatican, Gambinos are all one ball of wax that I've done many broadcasts on. As a far right-wing member of the Defense Intelligence Agency, he worked with the Israeli intelligence, and there's an article in the Examiner today, a quotation. This is the fellow that I referred to last week, Sabi Shabtai, who testified before the Senate Committee on Terrorism, and he's come to the conclusion that Muhammad Ali Ajah, the man who shot the Pope, has to be an employee of the Soviet Union because the Soviet Union would be the only persons who would want to shoot the Pope. Of course, it's propaganda. The shooting of the Pope has more to do with his direct links to Michael Sindona, Licio Gelli, and the organized crime syndicate, and the missing money of the Vatican, and the treasurer of the Vatican, who's from Cicero, Illinois, the hometown of organized crime, than it has to do with the Soviet Union even trying to shoot the Pope and get away with it. This is more propaganda that comes out all the time and goes before our Senate hearings. There's a large article in the Village Voice this last week, July 1st to July 8th, by Alexander Cockburn and James Ridgway. I won't have time to go in the whole article this week. I just want to mention that it is available if you go to the library or try to get it. And next week I'll go into it in detail. The thrust of the article is titled The CIA, Australia, and the Story of the Nugan Bank, the subject I've been covering week after week on these programs. It covers bases that the CIA overthrew the Labour Party and the Prime Minister, Gow Whitlam, in October 1975 and meddled with the affairs of Australia. I noticed that the very week that this story broke in New York City in the Village Voice and the Terpil story and Edmund Wilson are breaking in the New York Times, the Prime Minister, Malcolm Fraser, who was the recipient of the CIA coup in Australia, was entertained in the White House this week. They linked the Nugan Bank to world heroin traffic and the Green Berets and the CIA operations. This article goes into the Mayo Tribesmen, the Laotians, and the efforts to get them into the Caribbean, which I've talked about, and later to locate them in the Jonestown property in Guyana. They go further and they make connections of the Nugan drug trade to President and Mrs. Marcos of the Philippines and the laundered money of the former President Suharto of Indonesia, assisted by the Pahlavi family and the Shah's money of Iran and the narcotics with CIA dictators. For those of you who have listened to these programs week after week or year after year know that I've done individual broadcasts on the Shah of Iran and the narcotics traffic and the effect of the politics of Iran with his sister as bagwoman. I've talked about the money flowing out of the Philippines of the Marcos and their links to the narcotics trade. And this article connects Nugan and then Frank Terpil and the Seymour Hersh articles of Edwin Wilson and Theodore Shackley and the CIA. It's a very good article because it hits bases and then it touches another base, which again goes into the links of Nugan to Jonestown and to the operations down there, and it goes into the bauxite cartel. And on various broadcasts, I've talked about the melon interest and the bauxite, and this goes into the financial arrangement of bauxite in Australia and the monopoly and the use of bauxite for aluminum, controlling the world aluminum. And I've said that the Nugan Bank funded, I believe the money went to London and Germany and then back down to Guyana to fund Jonestown for the CIA. So I will do more on this Village Voice, but it is covering a lot of bases. And I want to bring it up because when I throw these names out or the activities of the Shah and his sister and the drug dealing and these various operations, there are major newspapers around the country covering these stories, but you have to take 10 or 20 papers or more a day or a week or listen to these broadcasts to know that the pieces of the puzzle are coming together. There's another long article I want to spend time with you next week on in the Los Angeles Times about a David Murdoch. He hasn't been written up much. There was just an article in 1979 in Fortune magazine. This is a man who has $500 million. He's similar to Howard Hughes and Daniel Ludwig in that everything he has is totally owned. He has a Los Angeles-based operation. He's the power behind Mike Kerb. He recently raised $1 million for the Republican Party in California. He has a company called Stair & Company London Antiques. He's a very close associate of John Connolly. He hired in 1979 Robert Haldeman to be vice president of one of his companies. And I'm going into the links of David Murdoch to the assassination teams that are in power that I've been talking about week after week. There is a combine here of John Connolly, Mike Kerb, Robert Haldeman, unknown money from private corporations. He's operating in California, and I think that he hits a lot of bases of Watergate, of what's going on around the country, and possibly the John Hinckley family. He also funded Ed Davis's campaign in California to become the senator in California. And in a week or so, I'll go into the links, again, the Glass House tapes and the Tackwood allegations of Ed Davis with the secret team of Watergate that worked with Haldeman and the people that David Murdoch works with. This may be one of those parts of, if it's a centipede or what, one of those legs of the assassination group. Unlimited money, millions behind politicians. The politicians are tapped in to past political assassinations that have never been investigated. We'll take a 1-minute break before we get back some of the headlines of the week I want to run down with you, and then I'll come back and continue on those.
This concludes the first half of World Watchers International with Mae Brussell.
I did an interview or a short newsletter with Tom Davis up in Capitola. I'll give you the address if you want it. I mentioned it before. It's an interview about the murder of John Lennon. Right, Aries Research, Box 1107, Aptos, California, 95003. And you send $1. If you don't get the address, this is too fast, you can write to me and I'll send it to you. And send him $1 and he'll send you a 5-page interview that we did on the John Lennon assassination. And in that interview, I talked about the special forces of the Nugan Bank, the kill money, their offices in Hawaii, their branches in Hawaii, the black money, and a travel agency they had, and the way Mark David Chapman traveled around the country and around the world. Wherever he wanted to go, he went back and forth easily. And one of the things I put into this interview was that Chapman's wife worked for a travel agency, and she was the person, this mysterious woman and her in-laws, who also bought him his arts at art galleries, who arranged his itinerary. The source of the money for his fare, his hotel, food, concerts, has never been identified, although Pacific Holding Limited, a tourism company that was formed by the CIA and the Special Forces, may be implicated. There is a Pacific Holding Limited set up by the CIA, the Green Berets, the assassination group in Hawaii, and I wrote for this interview, both groups had funds to hire assassination teams. And when I read the background of Mr. Murdoch with his funding of Mike Kerb, Ed Davis with that secret Squad 19 and the assassination teams from the LAPD, and his hiring Robert Haldeman, who covered up money that was involved in worse of things like the never exposed the shooting of George Wallace and the Mary Jo Kopechne murder at Chappaquiddick and the 30 deaths of primary witnesses at Watergate that went on. In reading the Murdoch article, the Los Angeles Times had said in 1974 he made the acquisition of Pacific Holding Company, Pacific Holding Corporation, publicly traded Los Angeles firm. He overcame existing management's opposition and moved in. They had no stock management, and people who worked there didn't own the stock. They were running the company strictly for their own benefit. Murdoch moved in, started buying up the stock, bought up all the stock, put the company under the umbrella of his private holding corporation. Now, is Pacific Holding Limited the same Pacific Holding Corporation that this Murdoch has? They touch bases or overlap of persons, personalities, capabilities, and experience, and it will take a little more research to find, but I said that this should be investigated, this group called the Pacific Holding Company and a tourism agency set up by the CIA and Special Forces. Remember when the Howard Hughes organization was used by Robert Mayu to hire assassination teams, the excuse was it was a private company, totally owned stock, used aircraft, nobody could get in and investigate it, and therefore the assassination teams of the CIA and FBI could be used by these private companies, and there's no way to get in because there's no having to account for where the money goes or who it's paid out to. And the night before John Lennon was murdered on this broadcast on the radio, I said this was December the 7th, 1980, and I repeat, as I've said before, that the assassination teams of the early 60s are all in place, and if not part of the murder, they're part of the cover-up. And I mentioned certain people like Ed Davis in this article on John Connolly, and Ed Davis and John Connolly are close to this Mr. Murdoch that who's been written up in the Los Angeles Times. There was another broadcast I did in 1979 on KLRB. It was an article from Pravda from the Soviet Union that was repeated in the San Francisco Chronicle. The title was Pravda Ridicules California. And the Soviet Union said California is a textbook of moral and social bankruptcy. If you need a classic textbook example for the study of capitalism in the last third of the 20th century, this is it. This is the moral and social bankruptcy. And then I referred to certain people working in the state that contributed to it, like Raymond Pecunier, who was formerly head of the prisons and undersheriff in San Francisco, and Charles Bates and Ed Davis, the man mentioned in the Murdoch article, and Mike Curb, the man mentioned in the Murdoch article. He is becoming the head of the kitchen cabinet to make Curb the governor and raised $1 million 3 weeks after the elections. These last elections raised $1 million for Mike Curb for an election that's going to be 2 years away. And the insanity that I talked about in 1979, that was 2 years ago, Murdoch links into Ed Davis and Mike Curb and plenty of that California corruption and insanity. There's another article in the Washington Post, that Maxine Cheshire, that I didn't get to finish last week. The wedding last Sunday of Susie Park Thompson marrying Robert Liggett. I just dashed through that last week. Liggett was under investigation by the FBI at the time of the Koreagate investigation. Susie Park Thompson was an aide to House Speaker Carl Albert, Speaker of the House, that little mousy Albert. She was his aide, and she was fixing up congressmen and senators in the back room. They had a little place where they could have their afternoon matinees behind the congressional walls. And she was fixing these various people up. Liggett, as I said before, had 3 wives in Virginia. He had 3 children and 1 wife in Virginia. Well, he actually had 3 wives, and he had another secret wife and 2 children in a nearby subdivision in the same county while he was making out with Susie Thompson. So that really wasn't a slip of the tongue. He had 3 of them going at one time. He was a great liberal Democrat from the Bay Area, and Susie was quoted in the paper by saying she was so afraid that she would hurt his career that when in 1976, when he ran for re-election, he almost lost the election. This was the time of the Koreagate scandals, the Rice scandals, the payoff of members of Congress, bringing in Reverend Moon, the Korean influence in our own domestic affairs. And he ran for Congress in 1976 and won from the congressional district up in Northern California. But then he stepped down from there and became head of some suspicious CIA firms in Washington, D.C., and I mentioned the Oceanic Institute in Hawaii, which is described in the Washington Post as a research arm of the oceanographic firm called Oceanic Foundation. So the Oceanic Institute exists, and then there's the Oceanic Foundation that he's the head of, and the Institute is described as a private business. You better believe it's a private business, and it does research in conjunction with the foundation, the Oceanic Foundation. Well, is this Oceanic Foundation linked to Edwin Wilson and the admirals from the Nuganan Bank in Australia that put a branch in Hawaii for CIA Green Berets political assassinations, where Mark David Chapman was to go after Georgia? He lived in Atlanta, Georgia, DeKalb County. That's the man that killed John Lennon, went to Beirut, Lebanon, Fort Chaffee, Arkansas with the Laotian tribesmen of the CIA, then to Hawaii. And there his wife ran this travel agency. And I mentioned in 1980, January 80, a year and a half ago, the Oceanic Corporation run by the CIA, an international organization, up to 1977, and Liggett was working for the Oceanic Group. The Oceanic Service Corporation during World War II was a Nazi group written up in a book, Sabotage, Secret War Against America. Oceanic was a group of Nazis that had allegiance to Adolf Hitler and worked sabotaging the United States. There's Oceana, George Orwell's Oceana. There's Oceanic Corporation. And I'm just wondering, these mysterious Oceanic Foundation, the Oceanic Institute in Hawaii, with Leggett's links to the CIA, the Korean CIA, and the entire links then to the Watergate Combine. Was he working and setting up or linked to those travel agencies that hired Mark David Chapman's wife and arranged the itinerary of this fella to go around until he finally met John Lennon in New York City in 1980, December the 8th, and gunned Lennon down. To update you on the Italian scandal, there are a few items in the news this week. Italy closes down its stock market as the prices collapse. They had the worst financial crisis in 64 years. This is what happened when Allende was elected into office in Chile. The American stock market, the American investors pulled their money out to cause a destabilization and would blame Salvador Allende for it so that even the liberals and the moderates would turn against him. This government was kicked out because of the scandals in Milan and Rome and all over Italy. That secret government that wants a fascist Adolf Hitler take over the Italian government. So when they got a compromised government into power this week, the Italian stock market collapsed. Also, the daughter of Licio Gelli was arrested in Rome, the 25-year-old daughter of the Grand Master of the Secret Lodge. She's been charged with espionage and criminal association. After 3 days of questioning, she went from France to the airport in Rome. She was a bag woman for her daddy and had hidden in false compartments papers linked to the P2 scandal, the secret Masonic scandal. Her father's wanted for espionage, political conspiracy, criminal association, and fraud. And he also is linked to the fake kidnapping of financier Michael Sindona and the massive tax evasion, bribery, and the collapse of the banks in Italy and the money being sent out of Italy. The daughter has been arrested, so whatever papers they found in the false compartment of her suitcase, they have more fuel to go on. I'm surprised that she'd go back with them. Also this week, Italy's military chief quits in the P2 scandal. Now, some of the defense people have resigned temporarily. Their security clearances are taken away, and one of the admirals that worked with General Hague, of course, in the NATO, the Armed Forces Chief of Staff, Admiral Torsi, resigned because of the Masonic scandal, and he's out. The newspaper said an alleged CIA report about the international plot and the records of their bank accounts in Switzerland were among some of the documents seized from the daughter of Gelli at the airport. So these were CIA reports about the international plot that she was caught with at the airport, and bank accounts in Switzerland that they'll have to go into furthermore. And the head of the armed forces, the chief of staff, has resigned. On the heels of that, there was an article in the New York Times, United States and Italy break up the operation bringing heroin into this country. The United States and the Italian authorities have broken up what they call major organization for using Italy for smuggling Southwest Asian heroin into the United States. You better believe that when Licio Gelli fled the country and Sindona's in jail and the Pope was shot and all the links, the international narcotics gang are linked to the Nazis. Licio Gelli, remember, worked for Adolf Hitler, Mussolini, Franco, and then went down with Perón in Argentina and then came back to Italy and brought this disgraceful scandal down on Italy, this crisis. All of a sudden, we learned that the narcotics market has stopped. It'll stop for a while because everybody is watching and the bag people are in hiding, and so it goes. If the discussion of the CIA and the documents and the plan to overthrow Italy are a surprise to you, I was writing about those invisible governments in when Watergate came in 1972, August 1972, that there was a hidden government in this country, specifically the Adolf Hitler agents from World War II, Allen Dulles, John Foster Dulles, working with Adolf Hitler's people to subterfuge the United States, to take over the Republican Democratic Party and put that third party, the Nazi Party, into power, which is Hague and Kissinger and Bush of the CIA and the people that are moving their way up to this total war against Russia at the present time. I pulled out an article I wrote for a local newspaper called The Nose. It was put out by Roger and Joan Lawrence here on the Monterey Peninsula during the whole anti-war movement. And I just ran across it today. It happened to be among some articles I was going through. And I wrote this in November 1973. I'm not going to read all of it to you, but it was about Gerald Ford, who had just been appointed vice president of Richard Nixon. And the paper, Mae Brussell, says, Gerald Ford, super spy, with a question mark. And this is what I wrote in 1973. One of the most difficult tasks facing both major political parties is the complex problem of separating Republicans and Democrats from the infiltrated espionage agents. A third party, the military intelligence agencies, have concentrated their power since World War II in hopes in the United States of a permanent fascist state. Richard Nixon, selected agent of the secret government, has now appointed more espionage agents to manage the White House, and that included Hague and Ford, the White House plumbers, the secret Army intelligence squads, and there are more now after the Watergate affair than ever before. And I'll read more of this on the air to you later, but in 1973, I was describing in a local newspaper a situation which has been in the front pages exactly as the Italian government spy scandal broke. See, we had a chance, and I've said this before, to eke these people out, to get rid of 250, 260 of them at the time of Watergate, and we didn't take it. So maybe it's too late. I don't know. Maybe we've blown the chance to stop them, or maybe we haven't. Maybe all the articles coming now are because the people in Washington and journalists around the world are recognizing that we stalled too long getting these people out. Licio Gelli in Italy was working since World War II to take over the government, but when too much money was gone and drained out and too many scandals, then they were forced to do something. And the straw that broke the camel's back, of course, was the shooting of the Pope by this group. And I want to go into that a little bit more with a few articles if I have time. One thing I do want to mention, and I didn't get a chance last week, May 24th of this year, David Copeland passed away. He was the person who used the nom de plume of William Torbett, researchers who have done work into the general umbrella story of the assassinations, have a book called Nomenclature of an Assassination Cabal. It's a private manuscript that he got out working in Texas as an attorney with people from the intelligence agency and people working in the Lyndon Johnson area, and he knew the Southwest. He passed away just this last May, and he was a close friend of Penn Jones, and they brought me the manuscript in 1970, in December 1970. You can order that Nomenclature of an Assassination Cabal, the same address I gave up in Capitol of Aries Arts. It's $15. It's an unpublished manuscript, and Tom Davis carries it if you don't have that book. There was an article in the Washington Post last week, a UPI story about Alexander Hague and the press, and it's just a short, I'm not going to tell you the whole story, but in there was a quip, and it says, at a recent Washington party, Carl Bernstein, the former Washington Post reporter who played a major role in uncovering the Watergate scandal, shook hands with Alexander Hague and congratulated him on his selection to the State Department post. After Bernstein left, Hague turned to another person in the room and said, "How can he do that? If half the things he had written about me were true, I'd be in the slammer, Now, the point is that what they wrote about Hague was true, but they didn't keep it going, and Hague was left looking respectable instead of the crook that he is. But now it's 1981, and this article goes on to say that Hague looks like Nathan Detroit, the gambler in Guys and Dolls, in his black and white chalk striped suit. So they're comparing him to Nathan Detroit in the Washington Post and the UPI, so that's not so bad. Another article, Pablo Letelier, 20 years old, will join the fight. I mentioned last week at length the murder of Orlando Letelier in Washington, D.C. on Embassy Row. His 21-year-old son is going to Georgetown University. He understands the political significance of his father's murder. This is in the Washington Post. And he appreciates the most notorious crime of international terrorism committed in Washington. I mention it because I'm really happy, I'm sad, but I'm happy to realize that some person is alive enough to care about his father's murder. He says he's going to study political science, he's going to study economics and politics and get a master's degree at a Mexican university and use his academic work and go down to Chile someday and undo some of the things that happened because his father was murdered and Allende was murdered. I've yet to hear one of the Kennedy children, or Ted Kennedy, or Robert Kennedy's children, or John Kennedy Jr., any of the Kennedy family, or Martin Luther King's family, to come up and even talk about understanding the political implications and the international implications, and that they want to join a fight to undo what was done and, to get the truth straight about their murdered parent. It's nice that Pablo Letelier has that interest, and he says every time he drives down the road there, the Embassy Row, he thinks about how his father was gunned down, and he was 8 years old when they left Chile, and he was going to school in Washington at the time. Another article in the Philadelphia Inquirer, the Boston Globe this last week on the Kennedy assassination. Why did the Navy conduct the autopsy? Now, I'll do more on this at length later, but can you imagine 17 years later, almost 18 years of research that we researchers have done? We're called paranoid, we're called theorists, research theorists, and now the Boston Globe is running articles 10 or 12 points on the wounds of Kennedy, that the Warren Commission failed to examine the clothing of the bullet wounds. They failed to consult the doctors in Texas, that the military physicians had never done autopsies before on with wounds by guns, that one man who had conducted the autopsies came in late to the hearing, a half hour late. They failed to dissect the tract of the wound of the bullet in the president's body. They incorrectly located the wound in the back of the head and the base of the neck by 4 inches. They failed to describe the wounds in the reference to Kennedy's body. They didn't use photographic evidence at the time of the autopsy, and so forth. In the Warren Commission, it went on to say one bullet went through John Connally and John Kennedy. And this is a long article from the Boston Globe, June 28, 1981, on things that I've talked about the 10 years that I've been on the air. What they don't say in the article is Arlen Specter, the man who made up and fabricated and lied for the CIA on the one bullet theory, is now a senator in the United States Senate. He is one of the senators from Philadelphia, from Pennsylvania. He was a DA in Philadelphia. He was the Senate of the United States, where the murderers and the cover-up of the murderers continue to get into power. I got another article from the Philadelphia Inquirer about John Hinckley Jr., the man, remember his name? He's the man who shot 4 people in front of the old Hilton Corral, March 30th, this last year. Hinckley is the best-kept secret in town. That's what this article is about, in Butner, North Carolina. That if people talk at the Federal Correctional Institute about him, they've been threatened to be fired. There's threats if they say a thing about him, that he's kept behind areas that nobody sees him. He was flown in on a military helicopter. They never see the man, and he's kept isolated from every single person. There's elaborate security, and Hinckley just is kept in a room. Now, they have this fancy team that meet him psychiatrically and try to pick and wash out those brain cells that remember who we saw in California, the Nazis saw in Illinois, the Nazis in St. Louis, the Nazis in North Carolina, who he stayed with in Washington, D.C., who took his picture in front of the White House, who paid for the Sheraton Hotel, who paid for his bus fare, who he sat with, where he was in California. All that will be out. They're going to keep him from March 30th until August, totally isolated, and then prove he's mentally deranged because he's isolated. What did he do before? He met people, he stayed at hotels, he stayed at a hotel where the Secret Service were, directly across from the Secret Service. He gunned people down. He may have had assistance. He may not have been the only person. But this article tells about the threats on people to even say anything about John Hinckley. He's something special, and you better believe it, because I think John Hinckley Sr. is linked to the highest levels of intelligence, and I've said before on the radio, and I'll say it again, I think George Bush, John Connally, and Alexander Hague should be removed from office, just like the Italian people were out, until the links of the Hinckley family to AID, to Cambodia, to Nigeria, to Guatemala, the CIA, the church fronts, till all that is open. These people shouldn't be making decisions. They shouldn't be sending weapons to torture other people. They shouldn't be killing people. They are the madmen from Auschwitz that have the power from the Nazi regime that formed the CIA, and they shouldn't have that power. This article goes on to say a federal grand jury is meeting in Washington to decide whether to indict Hinckley. And then it says others wounded in the March 30th shooting, aside from Reagan, were Secret Service agent Timothy McCarthy. You've seen a picture of McCarthy back at work, so he's obviously not injured. And it mentions Press Secretary James Brady and Delahanty. We don't see much of Delahanty. He was wined and dined, or was offered that trip to Mexico by Clement Stone, with his interlocking links to John Connally and the Texas oil people and the assassination team. This article, Washington Post last week, Brady, after 3 months injury, is making extraordinary progress. And it goes how well he is. He's got intellect, he's intelligent, he's got memory, he's got wit, he's got humor, he's got personality. Oh, Brady must be a barrel of fun. Can't you just see? You haven't seen him or heard him, have you yet? And this entire article, Washington Post, July 1st, doesn't even mention John Hinckley Jr. Usually when they talk about somebody recovering from this kind of injury where half his brain is gone, they talk about the assailant. Hinckley hasn't even been charged with shooting Brady, but Brady, right across the front, 3 months after injury, is making extraordinary progress. He is doing so well, there won't be any reason to indict Hinckley, I should hardly think. As I say, they're having a barrel of fun back there in Washington. Herb Cain had an article about Chappaquiddick this week. This is the anniversary, July 19th, on Chappaquiddick. He took a vacation and went up there to Martha's Vineyard, and he said the talk around town is the three persons theory, that Mary Jo Kopechne was in back of the car, and a person was in front, and Ted Kennedy had a girly party, and the car went over, and they didn't know Mary Jo was there, and that's the talk in town. It wasn't so simplistic, but the point is they're still talking about it. And on the anniversary of Chappaquiddick, maybe we should go back to the White House tapes of March 13th, 1973, where Richard Nixon is talking to John Dean about Herbert Kalmbach's bank records and how he funds Jack Caulfield and Tony Lasowitz, who was up at Chappaquiddick, and the trouble that they were going to give Ted Kennedy. And John Dean is talking about Chappaquiddick. Here comes Chappaquiddick with a vengeance. And the president says, in other words, we, and Dean says he is ready to disprove and show that, and they're not telling you much. And then John Dean says, if they get to it, they're going to come out, and this whole thing can turn around. If Kennedy knew the bear trap that he was walking in. Now, this is Haldeman and Kalmbach and John Dean, all these great authors selling their books, and Haldeman, vice president of Murdoch Company down in Los Angeles, a $500 million enterprise totally owned. And the White House tapes going back to Chappaquiddick, the anniversary this year, they're talking about the money of Herbert Kalmbach. He gave Tony Lasowitz about $100,000 a month before Chappaquiddick. And the president is saying, how will Kalmbach explain that he hired this guy to do the job on Chappaquiddick? But that was the bear trap that Ted Kennedy fell in, whatever it was, and I think I know what it is, and we'll do more on it in the weeks to come. But I have 30 or 40 news stories here to update you. There obviously isn't going to be time in 1 minute. This is the way the news is flowing. I've got things on Melvin Belli suit against Charles Hyam, on the Sirhan case, on the Lennon shooting, and more. The Goering art treasures that are being found, the Terpil Corcola stories. We can't do it all, of course, but I just want you to know that as the world turns, pieces of new information are coming. People are working and putting things together. On the one side, it looks dismal. On the other side, I'm the eternal optimist. Penn Jones in Texas, the great researcher and author, he calls me the eternal optimist. And I feel that these people have maybe gone too far or on the brink. And as we lose our allies to this insanity, we'll be forced to come to some policy that has been reasonable, or else lose our own friends and lose our country. In the meantime, I'll get back. I'll be studying the news of the next week and get back to some of these stories in detail with you later. Take care of yourselves and read the paper, and we'll be back next week. This is Mae Brussell in Carmel, California.
This has been World Watchers International with noted conspiracy investigator Mae Brussell. This program originates from Carmel, California.